Esteemed colleagues, ladies and gentlemen, to those in the room, thank you for braving the snow and joining us today. And for those participating online, welcome to a truly unique and cutting-edge event. Today, CropLife International, along with our co-hosts, the Biotechnology Industry Organization and the Council of Agricultural Science and Technology, has brought together a world-renowned panel of experts on agricultural policy. During today's Global Town Hall meeting, our distinguished panel will share their perspectives on agricultural policies for the 21st century and participate in a dialogue here in Washington, D.C., as well as around the world. Our goal during today's discussion is to begin to identify solutions to some of humanity's most pressing questions. How will we feed 9 billion people by 2050? How can we simultaneously grow enough food to feed everyone and preserve our land and water for future generations? What new pressures will farmers need to tackle as they work to produce food in the face of a changing climate? How can we help improve the incomes and quality of life of resource-poor farmers? And how can we find ways to make developing countries food secure? While there's no single solution to these questions, it is clear that we must continue Dr. Norman Borlaug's legacy. Dr. Borlaug received his Nobel Peace Prize in 1970 for using innovative breeding techniques to increase crop yields, empower farmers, and feed millions of people. It is incumbent on each of us to continue the late Dr. Borlaug's pioneering and tireless work to save millions from hunger. Dr. Borlaug's final call to action was published in a recent Council for Agricultural Science and Technology paper, which CropLife International is honored to bring to you today. In just a moment, our moderator, Frank Sesno, will introduce our panel, but first I invite you to watch this video that presents the challenges ahead.
And welcome. I'm Frank Sesno, your host and moderator for this extraordinary conversation today, where we try to address and maybe even answer the question, how do we feed 9 billion people on this planet? What do we need to do with the food we grow and the way we think about it to get to the answer? In addition to our studio audience here, we really have a town hall meeting of the most 21st century sort, over 1,000 live sites participating in over 30 countries on 4 continents. I'm going to introduce the panelists to you and begin this discussion in just a moment. But first, I want you to see a video about a legacy and a story, a brief story about Dr. Borlaug.
People, in effect, with his science, his commitment, his willingness to devote day in, day out of his extraordinarily rich and long life to the pursuit of human betterment.
And I am not one to sit idly by and see man breed himself into a corner by increasing his numbers faster than food production is being increased. And if I have anything to contribute to this world, when I know that our scientific facts are right and we have materials that can be brought together in a meaningful production program, I'm going to play that card and play it hard.
And nowadays, with globalization, these formerly completely isolated villagers who didn't know anything further than 5 miles away, they now have an ability to see what goes on in the rest of the world. And they see the rich world living like kings when they're still starving to death. It breeds within them an animosity against people who are better off than they are, who refuse to help.
It's absolutely possible to end hunger on this planet. I don't know why we haven't done it long ago, because It would only take a modest investment to reach all the people on this planet with adequate amounts of food.
This is an ongoing thing. When I was born, was about 1.6 billion people. Today it's about 6.6 billion, but it's still increasing at about 83 or 84 million more each year. If the people of the affluent nations want to hope to have tranquility and peace for their children and grandchildren, it won't be based on human misery and poverty, starting with hunger, lack of education, lack of medical service.
While Borlaug's enormous achievements in saving untold millions of lives from starvation have put him at the level of those people who have changed the course of history, he feels he will not have any lasting legacy unless his successors develop more tools and new technologies to feed the constantly escalating population on a planet with dwindling resources.
We know that Norman Borlaug helped lead the way, did amazing things, and has shown what technology and what ingenuity and human inventiveness can accomplish. But as the population grows and as these situations change, the challenges intensify. We have an incredible panel here today of internationally renowned experts on agricultural policy. They will engage these questions. We're going to take questions from around the world, a truly global audience, as to how we feed the growing world with shrinking amounts of arable land. So, to our panel. Gale Buchanan is a former agricultural scientist and administrator and former Undersecretary for Research, Education, and Economics in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. He's currently Dean and Director Emeritus at the University of Georgia. Mark Cantley served as forecaster with the Research Directorate-General of the European Commission. He started the Consultation Unit for Biotechnology in Europe. In 1992, he joined the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development. He's now an independent expert, and he braved the storm and flew all the way from the UK to join us for this conversation. Robert Paarlberg is professor of political science at Wellesley College and a researcher and a consultant on international agricultural policy. His 2008 book, titled Starved for Science: How Biotechnology is Being Kept Out of Africa, has a foreword that's co-authored by Norman Borlaug and former President Jimmy Carter, whom you saw in that video as well. Calestous Juma is a professor at the Kennedy School of Government at Harvard, where he works on innovative technologies. In 1989, he published the highly influential book, The Gene Hunters, to inform and improve the debates on biotechnology. He was formerly the executive secretary of the Biodiversity Convention. Nina Fedoroff is a professor of biology at Penn State University. She currently serves as science and technology advisor to the Secretary of State and the administrator of USAID. She's a member of the U.S. National Academy of Sciences and the author of Mendel in the Kitchen, a Scientist's View of Genetically Modified Foods, published in 2004. So, welcome to you all. Thank you all for being here. I want to pick up off of that video, for starters. And as I mentioned, and to our audience, we are going to be getting to these audience questions that have come in via Twitter, our Twitter stream, emails, YouTube questions, and of course our live audience as well. But let us start here by defining the dimension of the 21st century challenge that we saw teed up in that video. Nina, start us off. What are we up against?
Well, I think in the video you saw the population question. We're expecting another 3 billion people.
That's key to you, first and foremost, the population?
No. It's one of the parameters. The amount of arable land, of farmable land, on the face of the earth has not changed in more than half a century, appreciably.
Right.
Third, there's increasing competition for fresh water. A tiny fraction of our water is fresh water.
So population, land, water.
And
Rob,
climate
what else?
change.
And climate change. Sure. Rob?
Well, I take a slightly more regional look at things. In advanced industrial countries, the problem is with overnutrition, not undernutrition. We have a growing obesity crisis. I focus more on Africa and South Asia, where the numbers of hungry people are continuing to increase for the reasons that Nina mentioned. Also, lack of investment in things like rural roads, rural schools, rural clinics, agricultural research and development, and the extension of technologies to farmers.
Mark, your perspective from Europe when you think of the challenges ahead?
Yes, when you say from Europe, I'd start by emphasizing I'm not representing the European Commission.
You're speaking on behalf of yourself.
Thank you. I think the element, I don't disagree with what's been said, but the element I would emphasize is the management of a knowledge-based society. That's an easy phrase for politicians to use, but when you translate it into the specifics of research budgets, of trade tariffs, and elements like that, then you find your political consensus fragments into national and regional self-interests.
So, in a word, politics.
The politics of managing knowledge as it moves into the agricultural and food sector.
You wrote a piece I was reading that with a little bit of tongue-in-cheek, you noted how many politicians are scientists?
Well,
not many.
Not many. They're both very demanding occupations.
Okay, very diplomatically put. Gale, you wrote this paper, and you've had enormous influence with it, which is up on Cast now. As you look to this 21st century, your key indicators?
Well, certainly the increase in population is a very important parameter, but there's others as well. And that is the increased expectations on the part of everybody else. And that is going to be a very significant, because as the economy of the world improves, I think, and it will, certainly as people have more disposable income, one of the first things they want is more food, more diverse food, and all of those sorts of things. But there's another really big factor in here, and that is that as we move into trying to achieve some type of energy security, a part of agricultural output is going to be devoted to energy security, and all of these things are kind of coming together, and we need to be thinking about preparing for that now.
So it's not just food, it's also energy. It's
absolutely
biofuels.
You can't separate food from energy, in my opinion.
That's right, and that's one of the challenges. And as you were going down your list, Nina over here whispered.
And meat. Many people don't understand that it takes 10 times as much grain, 5 to 10 times as much grain, to make a pound of hamburger as it does to make a pound of you.
And water.
And water, absolutely.
Calestous, your view, 21st century.
I think for Africa, the key question is the interconnections between agriculture and the economy, because agriculture accounts for up to 70% of the African economy. So you can't actually grow the economy without expanding agriculture, and vice versa. So it's starting to emerge that, in fact, much of the work of African presidents is now starting to turn to managing agriculture, because that's the foundation of the economies.
So let's take these one at a time. Gale, back to you and to your paper. In your paper and in your comments there, you also you make reference to 4 countries or regions that are particularly relevant. Explain.
Well, certainly the 4 countries we chose to emphasize in the paper. You start with China, which is a major country with over 1.3 billion people today. So clearly this is going to be a major population center already, but it's probably going to even be a significant population center in the future. India is about the same boat, because they have a major population. So those are 2 countries that anytime you talk about food needs around the world, certainly those are major population centers. And of course, the expectations for better life and that sort of thing reaches to every nook and cranny of those 2 major countries. And of course, we all know about the increase in automobiles, and certainly the growth in personal transportation will be centered in those 2 countries. Then you go to a country like Brazil, which is probably the largest country on the planet that still has some yet untapped potential for agriculture. If there's any countries that does have some more potential, it would be Brazil. But then you get to the sub-Saharan African region of the world, and that's probably where we have the most concern, because that's the part of the world where more people live close to the hunger edge than anywhere. So they are really of deep concern to me because it involves some 40 countries, many which have fragile economies already, fragile governments.
Let me take one part of what you just said and throw this up to the panel for a moment. You mentioned India and China. India and China get so much attention in the media and as manufacturers and the great explosion of their economies. What they don't get much attention on is their capability to grow their food, to grow their capability to feed their own people and others along with it. So how are they doing? What should we know and factor into this conversation when we're talking India and China in particular?
Well, certainly, if you go back a few years, there was deep concern about China's ability to feed itself. But in the meantime, a miracle has happened. The Chinese have made tremendous strides in their agriculture. And, of course, they've certainly committed in agricultural research a lot of resources. And so they've made tremendous increases. India has done the same thing, not quite as robust as has China, but still very impressive. So I think that they're making the kind of moves that perhaps is a model.
Rob?
Well, China is a very interesting case. We're going to be hearing some gloomy predictions today, but not all gloomy predictions are accurate. Back in 1994, Lester Brown said that China would not be able to feed itself. Its import demands would starve the world, and grain prices would skyrocket because of imports in China to feed the animals that would be necessary to provide the dietary enrichment that more than 1 billion rich Chinese people would require. Well, here it is 15 or 16 years later, and diets are rich in China, increasingly so, but Chinese agriculture has responded to investments in infrastructure, investments in research and development. Production in China of wheat, maize, and rice has increased faster than consumption, and China is a net exporter of wheat, maize, and rice. So with the correct investments in research and infrastructure and rural institutions, you can take your fairly modest land base. In China, it's a modest land base compared to population, and you can have a very productive agricultural system.
So is China more of the answer than the problem?
Well, let me jump in here because I just came home from India, from New Delhi, where I was invited to come and discuss exactly these issues with the Department of Biotechnology and with the leaders of the agricultural research community. I think they're realizing that they need to invest much more heavily, but there are real barriers, and the barriers are not just in India, they are almost everywhere, and that they're political barriers. There's a real reluctance to use modern science, that is modern molecular modification.
Including in China?
In China, China's had its problems, but it's moving ahead, and India is moving ahead a little bit. Unfortunately, 2 days ago, there was an announcement that they've had a fantastic success story with BT cotton, but they're not moving ahead with their first food crop.
Why?
Because there is an element of urban elites that has turned itself against, and this is throughout the world, even in our country, turned itself against modern molecular biology because, in a word, people think that what they grew up with is natural. They don't realize how much modification has gone into making our agricultural plants. And they think this is unnatural.
And this sense of unnatural, this BT suspicion is not just about developing countries, it extends very much to Europe.
It's powerfully emphasized by those elements in Europe who are expert on publicity and communication. And that's not a set that includes the scientific communities. It's a problem, I find, of fragmentation. I mean, we've got in Europe at least fragmentation between the different agencies: agriculture, trade, research, development, environment, industry, education. We've got fragmentation between the European level and the national level. And we've got the fragmentation that comes from having 27 separate elected countries. So that any significant initiative will engender some opposition somewhere on one or more of those levels.
Calestous, are we seeing this as a global phenomenon? Is this something that's also happening in Africa, this suspicion of biotechnology, which we're starting to hear already in this conversation, is in fact the next leap or one of the prospects for moving this 21st century question forward?
We've had tensions in Africa, partly because of our close proximity with Europe, historical but also geographical, where we've been influenced to think that what the Europeans don't want also applies to the Africans. But we are also starting to see a change, particularly among African leaders, who emphasize that the future will depend very much on the ability of the continent to harness emerging technologies. And this is now being championed by the president of Malawi, who has had remarkable success in turning around his country from being a starving nation to being an exporter of food. And so I think the Africans are going to be looking elsewhere for guidance. They are looking to China, not so much to Europe anymore.
All right, I'm going to open the conversation now to you, to our audience, and you're coming in lots of different ways. Some of them here in the studio, some of them came with emails, and our Twitter stream, frankly, is going crazy here. So let me start with some Twitter questions, some tweets that we've gotten here. What can we do to keep food stocks from being diverted to biofuel? Are we merely robbing Peter to pay Paul? Who wants to have it, that one?
Oh, I'll jump right in
Go
here.
for it.
I think my rather radical notion is that we really need to look at desert agriculture for biofuels, using land that is useless for other purposes.
Well, it's interesting because we actually had an email question on this from someone in India. This is from Deepak. I have land in India in the deserts where water is scarce. What crop and what practices can I use? And if there are consultants dealing with such climates and products, please suggest.
Well,
Gale Buchanan.
Well, I want to respond because clearly you have to assume that energy is as necessary for our civilization as is food. They're both important. And this is why agricultural output has got to be a high priority of all nations, because one of the most important things we need to find a solution for is how do you convert cellulosic material into biofuels. And until we do that, we're still using old technology to use yeast fermentation to make ethanol. But we need other ways of converting non-food crops into energy. So this is a real challenge, and this is why one of the reasons why I was so anxious to work on this particular paper is this is a major challenge for all nations on this planet, and we've got to address it.
All right, what does anybody have to say to Deepak, who's asking what he does in India where the deserts are plentiful and the water is scarce?
I think that there are plants called halophytes that grow on salt water. And one of the most promising ones that has been developed so far for both food and feed and for food, feed, and biofuels is a plant called Salicornia.
Mm-hmm. Anything else?
I think we have also new polymers that absorb and hold water and can hold very large quantities of water in comparison with their own size. And only plants can extract the water from these polymers. Many of them are now being designed to be biodegradable. The Japanese are experimenting with this in Algeria. That's a real option for India, I think.
Okay, I want to reach back to another question here that we've got that came to us via email. And Mark, maybe you can take this one. Many Europeans, writes Michael, are interested in the politics behind their food. They often buy accordingly. What one thing can one, individual consumers, and two, EU policymakers do to make agriculture more sustainable globally?
That's quite a multi-dimensional question, isn't it?
Well, take it one dimension at a time.
Yeah. I think consumers can express an interest in the geographical sourcing of the foods that they're buying.
What does that mean? What do you mean?
Where did it come from? Who grew it? Where? Why?
Toward what end?
So that their purchases aren't purely dictated by the latest marketing campaigns in the supermarket.
Okay.
You see some very effective campaigns by various of the NGOs that can influence the short-term behavior of the consumers and influence the short-term revenues of the NGOs. But some of the NGOs are being tempted by the revenue-raising opportunities rather than by what I would call an honest strategic assessment. So I'm looking for consumers with more interest in an honest strategic assessment.
And policymakers?
Policymakers, I hesitate to say, need to learn to be honest. but they need to learn to prioritize the different messages which they have to balance. And I'm not that impressed by some of the priority choices which they make. They seem to reflect the next round of trade negotiations.
What do you want them to do? What's your bottom line?
I'd like them to listen to the scientific advice that they're getting and that they have ignored in Europe systematically in this area over the last 30 years.
In the area of biotech.
Well, I'm speaking particularly of biotech, but it would apply more generally.
Okay. Let's come to our next question. Here in the room. Go ahead if you'd introduce yourself and ask your question. Thanks.
I'm Martina Newell-McLaughlin. I direct the University of California System-Wide Biotech Program, and I know most of the panelists. Some years ago, I chaired a panel with Norman Borlaug, and I remember afterwards he said to me, I wish I was 50 years younger so I could have access to the technology that you guys are playing with right now, the things I would do with it. And that was incredibly optimistic, but I'm getting quite pessimistic in the context of the misinformation that seems to be prevailing out there. I've been involved in education outreach for about 30 years now, and I'm just wondering how on earth there are certain groups, there are certain activist groups that seem to be untouchable, that they basically carry a Teflon exterior and nothing they do is seen as impinging the progress of science and sustainability. How can scientists and consumers, and especially in regions within the EU, get past this notion that natural is good, when, you know, it's hard to convince people that some of the worst and most toxic things in the world are natural. And I just despair that science, where you're talking about facts, just doesn't carry the same sexiness and indeed can't counter the fear that's spread by certain groups.
It's a really interesting question, and it's actually something that's being asked widely in the scientific community. Why are scientists such bad communicators, or at least getting overwhelmed by all the other communicators out there? You've looked at some of this, some side-by-side studies, and what you found is really interesting.
Well, in response to the question about biotechnology specifically, I find it fascinating that in Europe, the use of modern biotechnology in medicine is not stigmatized. There's no consumer resistance. The regulators give approval as quickly as they can. It's only when modern biotechnology is applied to agriculture that advocacy groups start to raise anxieties and the regulators clamp down. I explain that not through reference to any difference in risk, because we haven't found any documented risks for many of the agricultural biotechnologies that have been put on the market so far. European academies of science have said that in writing. It's not the presence of risk, it's for consumers the absence of a direct benefit from agricultural biotechnology. This is in Europe, which is already well fed, and where farmers are already prosperous. Agricultural biotechnology doesn't develop the direct benefit in Europe that it can deliver in China or in India or in Africa.
Gale, talk about this battle between the PR and the science, if you will, for a moment, the question that was asked.
Well, first let me comment on Rob's point, and not only in Europe, but in this country. I mean, there's insulin, which is a very important biotech, and there's been no hue and cry about that use at all. But there's a lot of concern that a lot of people have that I think is important to recognize, that the things that we see in biotech and the reluctance to accept biotech are nothing new in agriculture. In fact, I can't think of any innovative technology that's come along in agriculture that hadn't been controversial at some time. Go back to even mechanization. I can still personally recall, some farmers when tractors first came out in the southern part of this country that said these heavy monsters would compact the soil and render our soil useless.
Oh, you weren't around when tractors first came out.
Yes, I was. Yes, I was. And also, when hybrid seed corn came, there was a lot of people that refused to use hybrid seed corn because they surmised that if you couldn't save the seed, there must be something wrong with it. And, of course, then in my own area of research in pesticides, we know the story of pesticides and what a controversial issue they were. So then biotech comes along, so why are we surprised? Everything that is innovative in agriculture has been of questionable use.
I'm going to go to a YouTube question in just a minute, but I'd like this side of the table to address this question of science versus popular culture almost, and certainly some of these issues that were raised in the question. What specifically can science do to respond, to argue back?
Oh, I think that what we haven't done is shown people how different the modern biotechnology can make farming. I think it's marketing. And
people are scared, right? They've been scared by a lot of it.
Sure. And frankly, once you put a cocoon of fear around something, it's extremely difficult to dispel. But we have to keep doing it. There are people who do this all over the world. Some of them are in this room. And we simply have to keep doing it. I think India has a tremendous opportunity right now to invest in that, in making the process by which these plants are gotten out to the consumer perfectly transparent and showing the benefits rather than leaving it to the...
Calestous.
Paradoxically, part of the resistance to modern biotechnology in Africa is coming from the scientific community that feels excluded from the research, where they only get offered the products of scientific research, but they're not participating in developing products, particularly those are relevant to their economy. So I think engaging scientists as genuine stakeholders will make a difference, particularly for Africa.
I think on the communication issue, Frank, one of the things we need to learn to do is to tell good stories that catch people's attention. I've been a little bit involved with Thingo Patricus on the golden rice, for example. Now, this is something where you could directly address vitamin C deficiency and save hundreds of thousands of children's lives every year. And yet this has been directly attacked by some of the NGOs, for example Greenpeace, in spite of the fact that basically it comes down to murderous hypocrisy. They know, and they are beginning to have second thoughts, that this is a technology which will save lives, but which has been delayed for many, many years in Europe and elsewhere in the world by the opposition of the regulators. And it's a perfect illustration of this false polarization that nonetheless suits the interests of some of the communicators in the anti-biotech movements.
I mentioned a moment ago that I wanted to take us to a YouTube question, so let us do that. Hatef has an interesting question on technologies and disparities. Take a look at that question.
What are the disparities in the top technologies that are being used currently in the industrialized world versus the technologies, the farming technologies that should be used in emerging countries? And how do we close that gap?
How to close the gap in technologies between emerging countries and developed countries.
If you visit a smallholder's farm in Africa today, what will strike you is the absence of really any modern scientifically improved technology. Smallholder farmers in Africa typically do not have access to any improved seeds. They typically do not have access to any nitrogen fertilizers. They typically do not have access to any irrigation infrastructure. They are stuck with the farming technologies that give them yields only 1/10 as high as yields in the industrial world, give them only $1 a day of income, and leave 1/3 of them chronically malnourished. So what you need in Africa is the most basic, absolutely the most basic technologies for a start. You don't have to worry about giving them technologies that are too sophisticated. You have to worry about getting them entry-level technologies that will move them from very low productivity up to something slightly better.
And tweeting in here, somebody from our audience, impacts on animals need to be taken into consideration too. Proteins need to be made available.
And veterinary medicine.
Indeed. And frankly, what we're doing in many places is bringing in sacks of grain. And that doesn't solve the problem. You remember the old saw of teach a man, give a man a fish and you feed him for a day, teach a man to fish. But today, it's good seeds, good fertilizer, and all the modern technologies. And we're not doing that.
Calestous, then I'll come over. Gale, you go ahead.
There was a time when there was a big gap between the United States and Europe.
Yeah.
And that gap got closed by building up the land grant system, which is getting universities at the center of the agricultural system. And I think the same needs to be done for developing countries, especially African countries.
I want to finish up one thing you were saying. Give a man a fish and you satisfy his hunger for one meal. teach him to fish, and he's satisfied until he catches all the fish in the pond. But you teach him to fish, grow fish sustainably, and you've got him fixed for life.
Yes.
Tweet, tractors, hybrid corn, pesticides were all rejected at first. Unfortunately, fear goes along with innovation. That's what we're hearing, too, from the audience. And by the way, I'm told 22,000 people now following us through our Twitter stream here, so not bad. Fear, innovation, how do we break that? Because that's what I'm hearing from all of you. We need the innovation, and yet we fear it.
I think one of the manifestations of this fear is the overemphasis on precaution. We've had a huge divergence between the two sides of the Atlantic on the precautionary, what you call the precautionary approach, or in Europe it's called the precautionary principle. It should basically be a pragmatic approach, the sort of thing that happened in the first 16-month moratorium after the Asilomar Conference, which was pragmatic, which looked at where the risks were and which backed off once the regulatory framework came out from the NIH. In Europe, we have totally misinterpreted the precautionary principle as a recipe, basically for saying if there is a risk, stop. Full stop. And that is a disastrous approach.
You're in this administration. Isn't this happening in the United States, too?
I'm afraid it is. We were lucky in the sense that we were kind of at the cutting edge 25 years ago, but we've gotten stuck with a regulatory apparatus that is simply doesn't allow anybody but the big biotech companies to develop products because it's so expensive. So that's a real showstopper everywhere in the world. Politicians hide behind this, severe regulation under the banner of protecting their populace, and
that's a lesson not to take from Europe.
Let's take a lesson from the room and go to it. And our next questioner.
Thank you very much. I'm Marshall Matz, formerly counsel of the Senate Committee on Agriculture. I'm delighted to be here.
Well, we're talking about you, I think.
Yes, and I'm going to take this dialogue to, I hope, the logical extension. Having just returned from Africa, where I spent a week on the ground with the Alliance for a Green Revolution in Africa, I actually come back more optimistic than when I went on the science. I think they are doing what you're talking about, Dr. Paarlberg, and it's so critical. I even think we're going to wind up, in a sense, expanding our land base if, in fact, we develop seeds that require less water. We will actually be able to grow on land that we cannot grow on. So, in a sense, we could expand our land base. What concerns me is the political will and the lack of translation between the scientific community here and in this room, all soulmates really, with the political leadership, and the disconnect as farmers get more efficient and therefore fewer of them are needed to grow food. They're by definition a larger percentage are consumers, and they don't understand what it takes to grow food. There's a lack of dialogue. It would be, Nina, as an American, I guess my question goes to you in particular. When I was in Iowa, Dr. Borlaug said, go back and push the politicians to the wall. So it's sort of in my instinct. It's what I do. But as one of those discredited lobbyists, I'm going to urge the scientists to push the politicians to the wall. How do we get the Secretary of State to address this issue? How do we get the President of the United States to address this issue, which would clearly get the attention of the European community? Everybody embraces technology when it comes to cell phones or communication or transportation, but yet they seem to turn off when it comes to agriculture.
And when you say address the issue, what do you want the Secretary of State and the President to do? What do you think they should be doing specifically?
Thank you, Frank. That's exactly the question. I would like them to address the topic of global food security, which they've put on the table and which I give them high marks on, but make the point more clearly that it cannot be done without the use of technology, and that the same people that are using their cell phones and their BlackBerries to communicate must embrace technology when it applies to food. I'm not disparaging organic or sustainable. It's a legitimate source of food production, and people like it and they can buy it, and that's fine. But in fact, you can't feed 9 billion people without technology. And it would be very helpful if Secretary Clinton said that directly. It would be very helpful if the President of the United States, who has embraced science on so many areas, addressed that directly.
Okay, Nina, there you go. You got the access.
Actually, I think that they are saying that and have said it. But saying it and doing something about it is, frankly, two different things. And what I think needs to be done, and I think our Department of Agriculture can take the lead, is to take those regulations. The world does look to the U.S., and we have one of the most complicated regulatory systems in the world that has no room for sunsetting. Once you establish that something's safe, you should be able to say it's no longer necessary to regulate that. We need to lead the way with regulatory reforms ourselves. That should be led by the FDA, EPA, and USDA, which are the three regulatory agencies involved. And then we need to be helping everyone in the world just design science-based regulation, which means that it must be responsive to accumulating evidence of safety.
Does that address your question? Did you hear what you wanted to hear?
Yes, but I would still like that major speech given by the Secretary of State on this. I'd like to elevate it to the front burner and get a more articulate, clear soundbite from the President as it applies to this, which we can then use in Europe.
It would be great, but it has a potential downside. We're already seen as trying to push biotechnology on everybody else. I think we need to look to ourselves first and then lead by example and by helping people not just accept biotechnology, but to create their own sensible regulatory
Well, then let's close with this thought. The Secretary of State invites Michael Pollan into her office, and he says, Michael, I know you mean well, but the deal is you can't feed 9 billion people without a little technology. And let's see where we go from there. Thank you very much.
You've touched a nerve here because there are a few others who want to say something now. Go ahead, Gale.
You didn't quite say all of what you needed to say.
Well, I was just asking a question.
The technology, and that's right, but you need to back up and how do we get the technology? And we have to make a different type of investment in agricultural research than we're making today. Now, that's the real clincher. And I think that if we do that, perhaps that is the best way to get more results that the public at large can appreciate. If you go back and read Dr. Borlaug's first Council of Agricultural Science and Technology paper, he talked about the public at large. So we're not plowing any new ground here. This is something that Dr. Borlaug talked about 40 years ago. And clearly, that is a key. And I think that if we have more research, we'll develop more innovative and thoughtful technology that the public at large can recognize, such as cellulosic ethanol and that sort of thing. So maybe that would be a step back.
Rob.
Thank you very much.
Yeah, there is a big role for the United States government here, and it focuses, in my mind, on U.S. assistance to agricultural research in the developing world, U.S. assistance to agricultural development. Unfortunately, since 1980, United States assistance to agricultural development in Africa has fallen by 85%. Right. U.S. assistance to agricultural research at the national level in Africa has fallen by 75%. That needs to be corrected. President Obama promised last spring at a G20 meeting to ask Congress for a substantial increase in that assistance. He leveraged that at a G8 meeting last summer in Italy to an even larger pledge. But it's the appropriations committees of the Congress that make the final decision. So I want stronger speeches from the executive branch, but I'd also like stronger action from the Congress.
A lot of tweets coming in. I want to just read a couple. By the way, technology and sustainability go hand in hand. Producing more, conserving more, improving lives are what all of us must focus on, says one. U.S. needs to lead the way on regulatory issues. Can Clinton get involved? You can't feed 9 billion people without technology. I mean, you've touched a very raw nerve here. Calestous, I know you wanted to jump in.
I was just going to offer a little example from Africa, which is the presidents are now starting to appoint themselves as ministers of agriculture. And you can't find a better way of exercising leadership than that.
Are they exercising leadership as ministers of agriculture in biotechnology as well?
And they are
embracing that?
They are actually asking to get access to technology, and we're not doing enough.
One of the things you've called for is clustering universities and communities in order to bring the sort of intellectual and agricultural capital together. Are they doing that?
They are starting to do that,
Where?
but they are not getting, take East Africa, for example. We are starting to see the emergence of a new generation of universities that are embedded in the Ministry of Agriculture. But they are not getting much help from their colleagues in the industrialized countries. Certainly they are not getting much help from the United States for reasons that Rob just mentioned.
But there's also money. So the investments in agricultural research in this country have generally run 1 or 2% of the amount that goes into biomedical research. In less developed countries, it's really very, very small. And the whole issue of education and the ability to, 20 years ago we educated thousands of African students. Today we educate less than 1,000. This doesn't make sense.
35,000 people now following this conversation on our Twitter stream, and let's go to a YouTube question and change the subject slightly, but to something that is no less challenging when we talk about how we feed the planet and how we feed a growing population. This question comes to us from Colin, and I want you to take a look at what Colin's question is via YouTube.
How would you go about improving farming prospects in nations which have been ravaged by war and other forms of civil unrest?
How do we go about improving farm prospects in countries that have been ravaged by war and civil unrest? And when we talk about parts of Africa and parts of Asia and so many parts of the world where we see vulnerable populations, we see them made more vulnerable, sadly, because of the world around them that is violent, undisciplined, failed states. We know the language. What do we do, asks Colin.
I think Rwanda is a good example of this. After the genocide, the first thing they did was to create an institute of technology. And that played a very important role in the reconstruction of the country. And they have expanded in Rwanda.
In Rwanda.
They have expanded that model to cover other areas of economic activity like agriculture. So education has a lot to do with it, and more specifically technical education.
Yeah.
Well, certainly, developing information is important, but in these situations, I'd have to put in a plug for something that was started in this country in 1914, and that's the Cooperative Extension Service. And I think taking information we were talking about earlier directed to the people that gives an extension of the technology we're talking about, and that I think is a very important part of solving some of these problems in countries that have been torn by war. I know in the a few years ago, we had a nice grant that the State Department supported in Iraq, and to take extension programs to Iraq. And I think that's a very important way of helping develop some of these situations.
But today we have tools we didn't have, and the extension service model that worked 50 years ago probably won't work today. However, we have cell phones and we have internet. There is a tremendous opportunity to disseminate information, but that doesn't happen without investment.
Correct.
I find it a little frustrating to agree with what you're saying, Nina, but to see the obstacles placed by the regulatory apparatus. We have at the moment in Europe a whole argument between the research and agricultural people on one side and the environment protection on the other over zero tolerance. We have a regulation in Europe that says there is no tolerance for any boatloads of grain where some NGO can find a single grain not authorized for consumption in Europe.
And if that happens?
If that happens, the boat is sent back to where it came from.
Literally.
Literally. That doesn't make the insurer or the shipper very happy. And basically it snarls up trade. So you can't divorce the trade issues and the regulatory issues in environment from the research and the agricultural. It's no use doing the agricultural research, having the products and the technologies, if you can't then trade them.
What clout does this administration, does the United States have? What kind of conversations are underway with Europe, if that in fact is the problem?
I think these conversations go on all the time, certainly through the State Department, the USDA, and so forth.
Is there any chance of moving it off the dime and breaking the cycle?
It is. I actually think it is moving, and I think, but not because of us. It's moving because what the EU is facing is because they cannot tolerate genetically modified soybeans, their feed prices are going up. They are facing putting their livestock industry out of business. So it's going to be that kind of pressure that will move
So it's the marketplace.
Yes.
The marketplace will have a tremendous impact.
But this was made by Marianne Fisher-Bowl, the Commissioner for Agriculture, well, up the end of the previous Commission. But she couldn't get the Commission to agree on a change of policy. So from the Directorate-General for Agriculture, she produced in 2007 a very hard-hitting paper saying, we are killing the livestock industry. And if this is adopted by the US and Brazil, and Argentina, the price of feed will go up by 600%. In other words, you will kill your livestock industry. But that was from DG Agriculture. It wasn't from the European Commission.
We have a question from the audience. Hi.
Hi, Denise Dewar with CropLife International, and I think you're speaking about it, but it's interesting because we've got a debate out there that's very polarized. It seems to be you're a supporter of conventional agriculture or you're a supporter of organic agricultural, and the media loves to play this up. It creates a great story. It gets the public into the debate. But isn't the reality that we need all forms of agriculture to feed 9 billion people? We've got to use every tool we have in the toolbox to address this challenge. So how do we break down this barrier of us versus them and get a real conversation going about what we need to do to feed 9 billion people?
Rob, what do you think about that? You've sort of studied the conversation in a sense. What response do you have to that question?
I think it's a perceptive question, and it does go to the center of the polarization that we see right now. There are surprising numbers of people, mostly advocacy groups from wealthy societies, who actually don't want African farmers to have a green revolution of the kind that lifted 100 million or 200 million or 300 million Asian farmers out of poverty in the 1960s and the 1970s. They are suspicious that that will only lead to more profits for seed companies or fertilizer companies. They argue that African farmers should rely on traditional knowledge, and they should stay away from nitrogen fertilizer. They should be organic. Well, I look at that and say African farmers today are using traditional knowledge, and almost none of them use any nitrogen fertilizer. They're de facto organic, and it's not working. Their yields are only 1/10 as high as in rich countries. Their income is only $1 a day, and 1/3 of them are malnourished. So those arguments make a certain amount of sense in Europe and in North America, where too much nitrogen fertilizer is used, but they're a bad misunderstanding of the needs of Africa.
Just to be provocative here, to take on your question, there was a tweet a moment ago that says, in having this discussion and this dialogue in terms of the virtues of biotechnology in the public sphere, are we hurt by the fact that the Obamas have an organic garden at the White House?
Yes.
Oh, really? So just exactly what would you suggest?
Well, I think that people really need to understand that organic farming is simply inefficient farming, which is why you pay twice the price for organic products. You have to put aside land to raise the animals or the green plants that you use to fertilize the rest.
But Nina, there is no way that in the media and the popular culture that you're going to be able to tell people that, you know, the whole local movement and organic farming and organic food isn't desirable. People are paying that premium where they can. They're rating it politically.
Why don't they combine it with the genetic engineering?
Curiously enough, that was in the original organic rule, but there were so many protests from people that didn't understand. Initially, the USDA said that because the technology has absolutely no risk that has ever been documented associated with it, you should judge the crop by its properties, not by the way it was prepared. But there were so many comments that came in on that original organic rule that Congress, by the way, went back and said to the USDA, go and fix this so that people are satisfied with it.
This is called political cowardice.
That is correct.
Did that tweet suggest that the Obama household is self-sufficient?
That was not in there. You can't get that. You only have 145 characters. No, I don't think so. Here's some others. Debate that's going on is currently very polarized. Advocacy groups from wealthy sector pushing traditional knowledge. Here's a question. Isn't it reality that we need all forms of ag to make the world, to feed the world? From Robert, African farmers are using traditional knowledge, as you mentioned. Here's a question. No, that went by too fast. You know, what can I say? I can't keep up with these tweets sometimes. Go ahead.
Well, I would just say that you need to use organic methods, but you should also have nitrogen fertilizer available to you. You should practice integrated farming. The limitations that organic growers impose upon themselves is, I think, an unjustified requirement to reduce the use of nitrogen fertilizer use to zero. That's not agronomically useful. It's very expensive, as Nina pointed out. There's no real justification for it. So use organic methods together with nitrogen fertilizer, and you'll have a productive agricultural system.
Go to a YouTube question here. Jeff weighs in with an interesting question that's not irrelevant to this discussion. Let's see what Jeff has to say and ask.
Hello, I'm Jeff Bidstrip. I'm a grain and cotton farmer from Australia. I'd like to know if there's any way we can have an international generic overriding registration for particularly the new biotech traits that are coming along, nutritional and drought tolerance, nutritional enhancement and drought tolerance. Maybe under the auspices of the FAO or someone like that. It's a great issue for Australia, I believe, and probably developing countries around the world that only have small areas, and we only grow small areas of maize and soybeans. Whether we'll even get access to these new traits given the cost of registration. So if we could have a generic registration that was then fine-tuned for the countries, I think that would lead to much greater uptake of these greatly beneficial technologies and change the way we do business.
Jeff is asking about a generic system of registration for these new technologies. Gale, can you help us on that?
I'm not sure I know exactly what he means by that. Can you frame the question a little bit better?
Well, I'm reading what we had from notes from his question. He says, can we set up an international generic system of registration? Can FAO or something implement something like this? High registration costs oftentimes hurt countries such as ours, so we won't get new technologies if they don't have mass appeal.
Well, let me comment that I think that any time that we can cooperate with other countries on any kind of agricultural issue is progress. And this is why I think that state does such a good job in working with other countries and fostering that type of coordination and cooperation. I know I've been involved in some FAO issues in which we try to look at pesticides from that perspective. So this has some real potential, but it gets at the heart of diplomacy that is certainly very important, and agriculture is a critical part of that. So I would say I'd like to hear Anita's comment on that, because I see that as a State Department opportunity to foster.
Yes, it is. But as I said earlier, sometimes the downside is that we're seen as pushing a particular technology. I think we have to involve the scientific community much more and really work with people, not to take on what we do, but to develop their own sensible regulatory.
Mark.
I was frightened by a couple of words in that question when it spoke about international registration systems. And I look at some of the performance of the international bodies and I am not impressed. I don't want to have every village parish making its own agricultural regulations, but neither do I want it to be some universal thing. It's a nice judgment at what level these decisions should be made, but I want to see the technologies made available and the choices made by the farmers, by the regions, by the small countries. And that should allow a large measure of freedom. You don't need to regulate the details of choices which should be made at local level.
So I'm hearing the need to regulate, but great caution about how much you regulate, because where politicians and international organizations get involved, it kind of mucks it up.
They should back off.
Yeah, I think the most promising development is that farmers are actually driving acceptance of biotech crops because they're better. So what we're seeing is the development of a lot of black markets in biotech seeds. We saw in India that the seeds were out there and it kind of pushed the government into approving it, and the uptake was phenomenally fast once the farmers experienced it.
You say farmer. I want to actually read a very interesting email question that came to us from a farmer, a small-scale dairy and maize farmer in Kenya. Now, bear with me with this, because this is a very thoughtful email that leads to a very pointed question. Gilbert writes, in 2010, Kenya's population is estimated to be 39 million. Per capita maize consumption, 98 kilograms. This translates to about 3.7 million tons required to feed the country. Production estimates by the Ministry of Agriculture data indicates only 17.6 million bags of maize were harvested between September and December, representing about 62% of the expected output of 28 million bags. He talks about another 4 million bags expected to be harvested in February. He says this marginally increases the total production to 21.6 million bags, which means in the year 2009-2010, the country has a shortfall of nearly 1.8 tons that must be filled by imports, or more than 18 million Kenyans, he says, will be hungry. He says this state of affairs has come about because the country has been slow to embrace BT maize production, and all the state has legalized biotechnology policy in the last 2 years. It restricts the seeds only to those developed through research in Kenya and does not allow imports of seeds developed elsewhere. Is he right? Is it a big problem? How do you change it?
I think it's a big problem. I think the first step is to try to get these countries to work a bit closely together, neighboring countries. Kenya doesn't have to produce everything that it consumes. Uganda could contribute to that. In fact,
how common is that? These regulatory restrictions to seeds that are developed in country, and resistance to imports and to imported, not just the seeds, but the intellectual capital that comes with them.
This is very common. This is one of the
trade barriers between countries in Africa.
Look at Zimbabwe on the U.S. Offers of grain, but it was GM grain, and they refused it, although the people were starving.
Where's a model to change it?
We talked about
I'm not hearing much.
There are words, but there isn't a model. Everybody puts it on paper. We have to lower trade barriers. But that's not part of what we're doing.
Critics say, well, biotechnology hasn't delivered in Africa. But if you go country by country in Africa, look at 47 countries in Africa. In all of the countries in tropical Africa, only one has yet made it legal for farmers to plant any seeds at all improved with modern biotechnology. Burkina Faso approved cotton 2 years ago. In the others, it is not yet legal for farmers to plant the seeds, and in most of the others, it's not yet legal for scientists to do research on the seeds. So the technology isn't delivering because it's been stifled by a blanket of regulations.
If that weren't the case, and we're going to come to an audience question in just a moment, but if that stifling were not the case, how much of a difference would that make in the lives of Africans?
A whole lot of a difference, because they're not getting access to modern technologies, and that has a huge impact not just on agriculture but on the economy as a whole.
This is how we feed 9 billion people.
Yeah, we won't do it without the application of modern technologies.
Your question. Hi.
Hi, Jack Bobo, Department of State. I'd like to make a comment and then ask a question. The first comment relates to the question asked earlier about international regulations. On the food safety side, there is the Codex Alimentarius, which falls under the FAO, which has already created international guidelines for approving these products. And there is an FAO database where countries that follow the guidelines actually do register those products. So to some extent, the food safety side has been addressed. On the environmental side, often seeds are done on a country-by-country basis, whether they're GM or non-GM. My question, though, relates to climate change. And people asked earlier, what can we do to find something that consumers will actually want? And I think consumers are concerned about climate change. And so the question is, how can we take advantage of this in order to explain that in order to mitigate and adapt the problem of climate change, agricultural biotechnology is one of the few ways that we're going to be able to do that. And so I'd be interested in comments from the the panel. Thank you.
Thank you. Climate change, important part of this conversation.
I'm impressed by what the speaker from the Department of State says, but I do recall that in the Codex there was a massive argument over whether or not to include a phrase about precautionary approach or precautionary principle in it. Thanks to the weight of the United States, that text was kept out, and thank goodness. But it did represent an attempt by the, let's say, the regulatory countries to tie down things which they didn't want to see traded and imported and so on. So that the fact that it was the FAO and WHO through the Codex Alimentarius Commission didn't guarantee that what emerged was absolute wisdom. In that case, the goodies won, but it doesn't always happen that way.
More on climate change.
First, I think that it's important to recognize that in agricultural research there's many, many things that should be done, in research to try to prepare for whatever happens in climate change issues. For example, research on drought-tolerant crops, crops that are more adapted to cold climates or to hot climates or to salinity. There's so many things that we need to be doing in agricultural research regardless of what happens to the climate and what causes that. So we in agriculture need to be preparing for global climate change through our research efforts regardless of the debate.
I actually think that we need to be thinking out of the box. Our contemporary crops use a lot of water, and their productivity falls off very rapidly with temperature above about 85 degrees. So developing crops that, to begin with, are better adapted to hot temperatures, desert crops, among them halophytes, the crops that will grow on seawater, I think we really need to begin to invest in developing those for biofuels, for feed, for food, and we're not doing it. And it's tremendously important in the central part of Africa, which is already getting hotter and drier.
Rob.
One promising research project was launched 2 years ago by the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation, which sponsored a $45 million 5-year project to provide drought-resistant varieties of tropical white maize for countries in eastern and southern Africa. In eastern and southern Africa, climate models foresee increasingly severe and frequent drought. Right. And if you can develop maize varieties better able to tolerate drought and provide a crop in a very bad year, that's going to be wonderful for the poor.
Does that exist now?
This project combines both genetic engineering approaches and conventional breeding approaches. It tries to bring the two together to increase the drought tolerance in maize varieties already in southern Africa.
But it won't be used if biotech products are not allowed in a country.
That's right.
And so that's the central issue. And I think the underlying paradox is that in democratically elected governments, political pressure can be brought to bear, and that's what happens, of course, in Europe, in India, and even in China. And that drives the politicians who depend on being reelected to go with the people who scream the loudest.
A tweet here, you're talking about corn, maize. We also had a question about rice and what's being done with rice. Anybody want to take that on?
Well, the Chinese are about to introduce BT rice. Stay tuned. It really has proved to be very positive environmentally, less pesticides, less pesticide poisonings.
More productivity.
Higher productivity, absolutely. And it's part of their emerging picture. They are investing a tremendous amount in agricultural research and moving forward. The advantage, for all the wonders of the wonderful aspects of democracy, it has its downsides, and that is this political mess that we're...
We're not going to quote you as saying that. I mean, be very careful what you say here.
I'm trying to be very careful.
Democracy has its downside. Ooh, that's kind of rough. But we have a very interesting... Well, I think we know. It's kind of like snow has a downside. Terry has a question that comes to us. It's an email question. It relates to the issue of climate change in a very profound way. Terry asks, what kinds of policies will we need to manage water supplies? And is there a global organization that currently does this? Calestous, water supplies, global organization?
We don't have right now a global organization that works on water, and that's probably a good thing, because I'm not so keen on global organizations. They haven't delivered in agriculture. And some of them, we think they're excellent places, but they're populated by warlords that go there to advance their own agendas. I think the solutions are going to come from innovations at the local level, and we are not tapping into those innovations.
What is that? Give me an example.
For example, drought-tolerant crops are an obvious way that we should be investing in. Secondly, I think in some aspects of agriculture we need to switch from cereals, say, to tree crops. In some places we should be exploring, say, crops like breadfruit as a substitute for cereals, for example, that would use less water. So I think that creativity is a better solution on this than simply having some big organization somewhere.
Gale, what's the bright future for biotechnology in terms of managing water supplies? Drought-tolerant
Well,
crop.
clearly, you've already mentioned the fact that developing drought-tolerant crops, but I would also add developing flooding tolerance in certain crops, such as what's happened in rice in the last year or so. So it works both ways. I think in looking at what we can see in global climate change, it's going to involve all of the variations of climatic conditions. And so we're going to have to be nimble and look at all aspects of how crops are adapted, and perhaps use some of the plants that's already there. You know, in so much of plant research, we're simply trying to take attributes of one plant and share it with some that we're more interested in. Like some plants have a tolerance to drought. We have desert plants, but they don't have other attributes. So we're going to have to really look at how do we take the desirable aspects of some plants and put it in the plants we're most interested in that helps us in addressing the need for food and feed and flowers and all that sort of stuff.
A little shout out, if I may, here. Agriculture students are the future of agriculture, and they're going to be, you know, living a lot of what we're talking here, and they're watching us, joining us on Twitter. So, for example, Texas A&M Soil and Crop Sciences Department, thanks for being part of this. Norman Borlaug's home, Oregon State College of Agricultural Sciences. We understand the Associate Dean is with us. University of Iowa, Friedman School of Nutrition Science and Policy at Tufts University. And last check, we had more than 30,000 people joining as part of this Twitter feed, and it's racing on ahead here. Somebody asks, is there a reference I can look up to see the data, some of the data that have been referenced here today? You want to talk about the CAST report?
Well, the CAST report, that anyone can download that by go to the CAST website.
CAST stands for?
Council for Agricultural Science and Technology.
Okay, and it's cast.org?
Beg pardon?
Cast.org?
Cast-science.org.
Okay.
And you can download the paper. And, of course, the paper includes a number of references to some of the things we've talked about, plus a much more in-depth assessment of many of the comments we've talked about. But I would hope that people would download the paper and read it, and perhaps you might have some good ideas. I know we talk about some of the things that might bring about a second green revolution, and these were the ideas that we came up with, but I'm really hoping that if everybody's watching would have other ideas that might be the subject of intense research, because, you know, I'm an optimist, and I really believe that we can address the needs we have to feed us and to provide energy in that. But it's a big if we invest in the research and education that it takes to do that. But we need to be thinking, I think, a little bit differently than solving today's problems or tomorrow's problems. We need to be thinking about those problems 50 or 100 or 200 years from now. And that's the whole purpose of trying to follow Dr. Borlaug's original paper, was to try to capture a little bit of the vision that he had about our future. Because I think most of us really would like to think that we're doing the things today that will enable our civilization on this planet to last forever, at least until the sun burns out.
Which is 2 or 3 billion years. So
Oh, we got
a shot at a few generations.
We got at least
there.
4 billion years.
Also, can I just offer one thought on this, Frank?
Yeah, sure.
I think we should look at Australia. You need leadership in some of these projects. Now, they combine a high capacity in science and technology with a very dry climate that's getting drier and a very strong export orientation. So they've got to put together...
What's their secret?
Their secret is that they can combine science and technology, trade interests, and their existing geography.
But is there a way that they're doing it? Is it just a matter of political leadership? Have they
Yes,
created new
leadership.
institutions to do that?
The problem has been that they've got a federal government and the state governments. Fortunately, as a result of the last election, Western Australia... Well, no, I'd better back off a political comment like that. Let's say...
I was just getting good.
The research choices may be strongly influenced by the results of the democratic process.
Well, our democratic process brings us back into the room, so why don't you go ahead with your question?
I'm Vinay Dowry. I'm a MS Biotech student at Georgetown. So my question gets back to the whole climate change adaptation debate versus the GMO issues we've been talking about here. I mean, it seems to me that the problem isn't really with biotech, but how we're applying it, kind of applying it towards primarily these mega crops and monocultures like maize, corn, wheat. Can you talk about that? There's some research to suggest that we're kind of losing some of the genetic variability that's inherent in some native species that are not commercial crops that we need to adapt to climate change. They're in some cases, better able to maybe deal with climatic conditions in the future.
What would your question be out of that?
Just to hear the panel's thoughts on that.
I think that there are people that believe that the variability that's inherent in the crops we grow now needs to be brought back into the highly productive crops. However, climate change is going to be so rapid that we can't go back and do the breeding. This takes a very long time. If you start with a really highly productive corn plant that makes an ear this big, you don't go and breed it to something that may be a little bit more tolerant, because you bring in thousands and thousands and thousands of genes. What you want to do is take that particular strain and extract the genes that you want and put it in. So you have to know what the genes that you want are and move them so that you don't lose all the productivity gains that you've developed over hundreds and thousands of years, in fact, in the case of maize. That's the challenge. The question of crop variability, the genetic diversity of crops, there are gene banks all over the world, and there's an international crop seed trust. And so I think that preserving and growing out those strains as sources of genes is important. It's being done. But if you can't move them, you can't move ahead. And that's the central dilemma.
Isn't this one of the points why genomics is becoming so important? As its cost goes down and the diversity that it's revealing gives you opportunities for diversifying your productive crops.
Yes, but what that uncovers is all kinds of genetic variation. It doesn't say, this is the gene that you need to move. So there's an awful lot of research other than genomics that needs to be done.
So you need to increase the research budget.
Absolutely. And again, I go back to even in our country, the fraction of the research budget in biology that goes to plant research is very small. And there's another paradox in our country. The regulatory complexity has really driven many of our wonderful plant scientists to work in other model systems and focus on basic physiological mechanisms. That's great, but we need to make it easier for people that want to help farmers to get biotech crops out to farmers. And that, I think, can be done within the USDA by creating a public facility that does the testing and the regulatory approval process.
In just a moment, we're going to hear from another farmer, courtesy of you two. But Rob, I want to come to you. You're our political scientist here. You're hearing about, budgets and making the case and all the rest. And again, I want to turn to you on that. What do you make of that, and how does that get done?
Well, too often in the United States and elsewhere, we make the mistake of leaving agricultural research to the private sector. The consequence, whether it's conventional or molecular biology research, the private sector is going to invest in commercial crops, big commercial crops, where they have a large base of paying customers. So the crops that are most important to low-resource farmers in the tropics, whether it's sweet potato or cassava or sorghum or millet, those will be orphaned crops. They will not receive adequate research investments from private companies. It requires public sector investments in agricultural research to get innovations to the farmers who need them the most. And that applies both to conventional as well as to modern biotech research. So it was a very good question. I would expand that question, though, to emphasize the importance of public sector research for conventional as well as biotech investment.
A couple of tweets here I just want to pass on to the panel and to the audience. Decline of biodiversity. Isn't a biotech cause problem, writes one. Let's see. What would happen if crop protection technologies were no longer used is a question. There are other methods like marker-assisted breeding to speed up conventional breeding, writes another. So we're getting a lot of people weighing in on this issue specifically. I mentioned a farmer and a question that we've got via YouTube. Take a look at what Chad has to ask. His question takes us to a slightly different place. Oh, I'm sorry. We don't have Chad. We'll go to another question from Christopher that takes another look at the problem.
Christopher Lancette, age 41. My question is, with all the technology we have available in this country and throughout the world, how is it possible that hunger is still a problem?
with all the technology available and all the things we've discussed here today, I think is implicit in that question, how is it possible that hunger is still a problem? It echoes what George McGovern said in that opening video, doesn't it? We shouldn't have this. Do you agree with that?
If you visit Africa, you will find that most people living in the countryside are farmers. 60% of all Africans depend upon agriculture. Those who live in the countryside will typically be cut off from access to modern technology. 70% of all Africans live more than a 30-minute walk from the nearest all-weather road. So transportation costs, getting fertilizer to them and getting their products to a market are so high that they are simply isolated. So we have the technology, but they don't have access, in part because of inadequate investments in rural infrastructure.
I couldn't agree more. I think building roads will do more for African agriculture than all the plant breeders put together.
Wow. Another shout out to some more who are watching our program here today. University of Maryland School of Agriculture, University of Wisconsin-Madison College of Agriculture and Life Sciences, and University of Georgia. Anything more you want to say on that?
I want to hear more from the plant breeders.
Well, you know, I want to comment. You know, one of the great things we did in this country many years ago, when I was younger, many years ago, was what we call farm-to-market roads. And they built little paved roads all over this country. And you're right, that is a tremendous asset to agriculture. And a lot of people, I wouldn't say it's more important than plant breeding now, get me. But it is important and very critical.
I think people don't realize how systematic our improvement in agriculture was early in the century. It wasn't just roads. It was roads and it was education, the whole extension service. It's a complex problem. I think people are finally articulating what needs to be done in Africa, but it costs an immense amount.
Well, and the other thing that's very different from that earlier part of the century and earlier on is the interconnectedness and the globalization and the international commissions and entities that both enable but also are obstacles in this process, as we've heard here today. Question from the audience. Go ahead. Hi.
Yes, I'm Kevin Finneran with Issues in Science and Technology at the National Academy of Sciences. And although I'd like to believe that science will solve these problems and if we could just do the research, get rid of the regulatory barriers, we would be fine. But as Bob Paarlberg mentioned about research, the structure of the seed industry is an impediment to certain types of innovation. As Calestous pointed out, there are other factors within countries that prevent the agriculture from being innovative and productive. So I'm just curious how you place the biotechnology and regulatory problems in the larger context of what are the things that we need to address in terms of management practices, availability of capital, a number of other factors that are going to be needed to really make agriculture in the developing world productive. So what are some, you've started to talk about those, but I wonder what the others think and what are the most important ones in your mind.
It's the economy.
Go ahead.
This is my earlier point about bringing this matter in the offices of the presidents of the developing countries. It's very important. If you take the example of roads, the Minister for Agriculture cannot tell the Minister of Roads to go and build a road to a certain place because it will stimulate agriculture. He doesn't have that authority. It has to go to the president to make those decisions. This is why I think Africa differs to some extent with other regions of the world, because the bulk of the economy is agriculture. And so my view is that it has to be coordinated at a much higher level than just leaving it either to particular departments or specific ministries, because the entire system of the economy is predominantly agricultural. Therefore, a head of state in an African country is essentially the head of agriculture. In most cases, they don't know that.
Ron?
And part of the economy, the economic issues is that there isn't widespread use of either credit or insurance. So those are also big economic issues that are impediments to agricultural development.
Rob, you've looked closely at Africa.
Well, in answer to the question, I would say we can learn some things from China. China 30 or 40 years ago was considered to be in serious trouble agriculturally. But Deng Xiaoping in 1978 initiated institutional reforms, the household responsibility system, that gave individual farm households, once again, effective control over their land, an incentive to protect the land, to be more productive, an opportunity to sell their products in an open market. The Chinese government made large investments in agricultural education in the countryside, agricultural education, and also rural medical clinics. In cities, they built up a university system that trained engineers and agricultural scientists. They put a lot of money into public institutes to develop research projects. China was the first to develop hybrid rice. It wasn't developed by the International Rice Research Institute. It was developed by Chinese scientists funded by the Chinese government. They built rural roads. They made a series of wise investments over a 10 or 20-year period that has now put that country on a strong agricultural foundation. So it doesn't have to come from the United Nations. It doesn't have to come from NGOs. There weren't too many NGOs in China. It comes from governments that have a long time perspective.
Here's a tweet, cut to the chase. How does ag that can feed the world get through the socio-political elitist conversation? Mark?
I was just thinking about what Rob was just saying. I was thinking about the United States 100 years ago had a much more rural economy.
Yes.
And at that time they were building the infrastructure. You had the state agricultural experimental stations. You had the decision making being made at a state level. Something seems to have changed over the last 3 or 4 decades, that as the workforce in agriculture has diminished, the interest in public support for agriculture has diminished likewise.
How do you change that?
Well,
how do you address it? Because that's true.
That's essentially true, but I want to make a couple of other comments. First, our forefathers that started some 100 and so years ago, when they hit on the idea, they recognized that to build an economy, they had to support really 2 areas. They had to support the manufacturing area, which built something people wanted, or they had to support agriculture, which grew something that people would eat. And so that's why the land-grant university concept was formed. And, of course, that has become a part of our country. And, of course, now we have a lot of other institutions that's involved in agriculture. But certainly the land-grant institutions played a key role in providing the framework of that infrastructure that has been so helpful in getting agriculture where it is today. But I think that probably the thing that's most significant is the fact that it did involve not only the institutions, but it also involved people, and that's where the extension got down to the local farmer level. Extension people actually went to the farm and helped calibrate sprayers and talked directly to farmers. And that's why the comment I made earlier about how important it is to have that kind of linkage to who's generating the technology to the people that's going to use it. And I still think that's a very important aspect of getting us to where we want to be, because I think developing countries really could use this type of relationship. Certainly it's got to be tailored for the unique country.
There are a lot of questions we've got on infrastructure. Somebody tweets here, how about, we're talking about infrastructure, what about dealing with the infrastructure in the United States? By the way, Texas A&M, here's somebody says, Texas A&M doing great research on salt and heat-resistant plants that may prove to be very promising, so go Texas A&M. But Meg has a YouTube question on the subject of infrastructure. Here it is.
My name is Meg, I'm 24, and my question is, how do you balance getting people who are hungry food immediately versus setting up an infrastructure so that it's not only easier to get food to these people, but that they can ultimately become self-sustainable?
Self-sustainable infrastructure for people who are hungry. Calestous? You talk about how it goes to the presidents. I mean, you know, how do you get
because you can't, if you can't move seed and you can't move produce, you can't feed people. So infrastructure is really fundamental to actually creating a sustainable economy. So I don't see it as a trade-off. In fact, one is necessary. I mean, infrastructure is really necessary for agriculture. And without it, then you go back to subsistence agriculture, where people grow only the stuff they are going to consume because they can't move it. You can't create food processing industries if you don't have infrastructure. So I think to frame it as a trade-off is to miss the point.
I've asked you about models in the past, if we're going to learn from this discussion and find sort of best practices on the in the area of infrastructure, for example, and connecting, where would you look? And what would be the lesson for other governments?
I think China offers a very, very interesting examples. In fact, the OECD in Paris is now understudying the Chinese experience, and the intent is to share it with developing countries. And there's now evidence that in China, low-cost roads, in fact, contributed more to the expansion of agriculture in rural areas than more expensive roads. So we have role models that give us indications on how to do it.
Nina, tweet question for you. How involved are hunger advocacy groups in addressing some of these issues?
The hunger advocacy groups often focus on food aid, and food aid won't go away, but again, building the infrastructure, the ability to grow food locally has to be increased. Over the years, we've gone to putting more and more of our aid money into food aid. And that really has to be reversed. I think the World Food Program is diversifying and trying to build more capacity. But food aid will never go away. We just have to change the balance.
But isn't it true that a lot of the NGOs are, in fact, trying to teach people how to fish, not just give them a fish?
Yes and no. I think there are some wonderful examples of NGOs, and I would quote one called Kickstart International, which is basically trying to develop businesses that help people increase their income levels to be able to buy food by providing them simple machines such as water pumps, foot-operated water pumps, to be able to grow food in the dry season. That's one of the problems in Africa.
I think a lot of the NGOs are a poor substitute for agricultural training institutes. That's where the action ought to be. Most of them are learning how to do agriculture in Africa, not teaching.
Teaching is the way. Education is the way in. Question from the floor. Hi.
Hi, yes, I'm Christine. I'm here from Switzerland. Thanks for this very interesting discussion. In the wake of the food crisis that we experienced in 2008, many governments and international institutions are focused on the topic of food security and developing strategies around food security. But I'm afraid that this term means many different things to many people, like the term sustainability. So I wanted to hear from the panel, what does food security mean? What does it take to get there? And specifically, what's the role of trade versus self-sufficiency in achieving food security?
Gale, why don't you start us with that?
Well, that's a very good question, and certainly I would start by saying that you're right on target in that finding a way to provide food security is important for all people. But what it really means to me is the fact that you have the ability to enjoy a reasonable life. And I know the arguments we had, I was around in 2008 and the discussion over food versus fuel and that sort of issue. But really it's a challenge to appreciate how important it is for all people. And of course, food security and energy security go hand in hand, as we talked about earlier. But finding a way to ensure that all people have access to food is the challenge we have facing us. And I don't know any other way to say it other than that's one of the most important challenges we have facing humanity today.
Others? Mark?
I'm slightly concerned about this discussion because I see the U.S. being very generous with its food aid in terms of shipping materials over. But the shipping of this aid has to be in U.S. ships, and it has to be related to what is available from the U.S. surpluses, whereas in fact the cost of this would purchase a much larger provision of locally produced maize if you directed the money to the country and if you could ensure that it reaches the farming community.
So would you like to ask a question of Nina here in that regard?
So what's gone wrong, Nina?
What?
Things went wrong, not entirely on my watch, but over 3 decades. The fraction of our food assistance that's gone into food aid has just increased and increased and increased. It's Congress that specifies that it has to be creates the restrictions that specify that it has to be American bought and shipped in American ships. I think there's a movement internationally to more locally purchased food. Again, that really needs to be done sensitively because it can also feed corrupt practices. So I think that we have to move toward balancing, increasing our investment in agricultural research, providing the tools to increase local productivity. It's gradually happening, but the problem was created over 3 decades, and it'll probably take a few years to solve.
I think in the previous administration, they did provide that a portion of food aid could be locally purchased, and I assume that's still the rule now. But you're right, and of course, I think that brings up the point that it's more than a shortage of food, it's a shortage of resources to purchase food. That's the real challenge that we have, I think.
But again, the trade barriers are important. So Malawi became a food, it really was able to grow once the leadership was convinced, in opposition to pressure from NGOs sometimes, not to subsidize seeds and fertilizer. They did that. They became excess producers, but then they got stuck because sometimes they couldn't sell their product.
That's why the trade issue becomes so important. Countries need to be able to produce what they can most effectively produce. And then if we've got good trade relations, then you can take what you can produce and sell maybe for energy and buy more food than you could grow in food. So that gives the whole world more flexibility.
Rob.
Trade barriers are important on the other side, too, not just import restrictions, but export restrictions. The question referred to the 2008 world food crisis when the price of rice on the world market tripled. Why did that happen? It wasn't because we were growing less rice or consuming more. It's because governments around the world, worried about food price inflation, a macroeconomic factor, put barriers on the exports of their rice. India blocked its exports of rice. Vietnam blocked its exports of rice. Indonesia blocked its exports of rice. China blocked its exports of rice. That created a shortage of rice on the world market, so the international price tripled, and the few countries that depended upon imports of rice were hurt badly. If there hadn't been export restrictions simultaneously imposed, the price of rice on the world market would not have tripled.
So that is clearly what not to do if you're going to feed 9 billion people.
Yeah, exactly.
We had a very thoughtful question from the floor a moment ago about how you define food security. There's another very thoughtful definitional question from somebody from our Twitter stream, Michelle, who asks, how do you see agriculture effectively communicating what a truly sustainable future looks like for both North America and countries with greater need? Given the debate around sustainability, how do we define that in a way that is meaningful to society?
There's been a lot of discussion about just what does sustainable mean. And clearly, I guess we all can come up with our own definition, but it's being able to use something and not use up the ability to produce more or to use more. So it's very difficult to really define in definitive terms. But sustainable has come to mean that we can continue and not run short.
Is that how you define it?
Yeah.
Continue, that actually fits on a bumper sticker.
Yeah.
Continue and not run short?
I agree
Is
with
that
Gale
adequate?
there. I agree with Gale. I think we should be very suspicious of the word sustainable. I think there are occasions when you should be prepared to trade, let's say, the coal that's underground, dig it up, use the revenue from that, and build education academies to produce a knowledge-based economy of tomorrow. That's a little bit simplistic, but this is the sort of trade one thing for another. You drill for the oil, you dig up the coal, and you finish up building infrastructure oriented to the future. Sustainable does not mean preserving everything in a museum-like philosophy.
Correct. What does sustainable mean for you? Sustainable agriculture.
I think for me, at this particular time, is being able to produce food without undermining the capacity of the ecosystem to support future generations. And if future generations mean actually people who are already now present today, that's really what it means to me.
I think one of the things on a much more mundane level that sustainability means is reintegrating the nutrient flows. So today we put too much nitrogen, we pull nitrogen out of the air, put it on the land, it runs off into the water, creates dead zones, and then we have a problem with animal wastes. Now, reintegrating those nutrient flows is part of the notion of organic agriculture, but it really needs to be done on a very large scale. perhaps the place that it's being done most effectively is in aquaculture. So you can integrate the growing of plants and the food for aquaculture and the water supplies, cut the water supplies off from runoff. Mm-hmm. In other words, today some of the aquaculture is done in such a way that the runoff pollutes the ocean. But you really need to isolate those systems, integrate them so that plants use the nitrogenous wastes that come from the animals, and that's part of it.
I just thought that sustainability is doing something that does not irritate your neighbor.
It does not. It does not irritate?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. That fits on a bumper sticker too, I suppose.
I think it's worth mentioning that the countries that are making the greatest progress towards sustainability are those that are also making the largest investments in agricultural science and technology. A wonderful report from the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development came out 2 years ago on the environmental performance of agriculture in these wealthy OECD countries. Excess nitrogen use is down, pesticide use is down, greenhouse gas emissions from agriculture is down, the use of water in irrigation is down, biodiversity on the farm is up, even though production is up. This is made possible in these countries by large investments in agricultural science and technology.
To the floor, and another question. Hi, go ahead.
Hi, thanks.
Thanks for waiting.
Craig from Canada, and I'm a little perplexed by all the discussion about the snow here, as it seems like an average snowfall, but I'll move on.
This is just a dusting where you come from, right? 3 feet is just a dusting.
We've bounced around a lot, and I was hoping to take the panel back to focus a little bit on the regulatory systems discussion. It seems like where farmers have had the opportunity to adopt the technology, they have adopted it whole-handedly to market saturation levels in just a matter of years. So I reviewed a report by the European Union Joint Research Commission. They produced a report called Products in the Pipeline. And what it did is that it surveyed the world, and it said this is where the technology will come from, GM technology will come from by 2015. And one of the major conclusions of the report was that by 2015, 50% of the new technology introduced will be from Southeast Asia, and it'll be from governments or the academic sector. That is a stark contrast to what we have seen to date, where it's largely coming from multinationals and all the fallback from a PR perspective, if you will, of bringing that forward. So the question to the panel is, in the future, when the technologies are coming from governments, will that change the regulatory landscape?
Great question. Mark, what do you think? You want to start that?
Well, my immediate reaction is to say it should. And if you want a longer answer, I'd add, but it probably won't.
Okay. Well, don't stop there. Keep going.
Well,
explain.
You're right. I mean, I think that what Europe has been doing, and this is why I accepted this rather aggressive title, is because I think we have been making major strategic policy mistakes. And I think that the Chinese and other major countries on the other side of the planet, I'm thinking of Australia, Indonesia, so on, can learn from our mistakes. They can see that the private sector is not going to give the long-term oriented research that is needed for basic innovation in agriculture. As to whether that will cut across to the regulatory framework, it might. If they learn intelligently from Europe's mistakes, they have a good chance.
Thank you. Anybody else?
I think Mark did a pretty good job.
Sorry?
I said you did a pretty good job.
Oh, thank you.
But how?
I think we'd like to learn from our own mistakes.
And take advantage of them.
I'd like to throw in an optimistic note. I think India is moving toward an integrated one-stop shopping regulatory apparatus. And I think that the questioner pointed out, that once farmers get a hold of the new seeds, it spreads like wildfire, and in some cases, such as the case of Brazil, it really pushed the government into approving it. I was in Brazil not long ago, and the farmers are solidly behind it, and you won't undo that. So I think you're seeing movement.
We've had a very interesting conversation here today, and we're coming to our closing minutes. I want to thank our agriculture schools and others who've been online with us, and our tens of thousands of people who have joined the Twitter stream, the emails, the YouTubes. I mean, it's been really a fascinating and truly global conversation. I'd like to ask each of you to think about the fundamental question that brought us here today. How do we feed 9 billion people? And give that the context of biotechnology and the kinds of technological and intellectual breakthroughs, agricultural breakthroughs that are going to be needed, along with the political infrastructure and all the other things, and try to condense it, if you will, to a scorecard. That if you were to see real progress in the next 5 years, let's say, what would we see happen? What would change? Nina, I want to start with you, and I want to start, in fact, by reading just a short excerpt of an article that you co-authored with several others that's published just yesterday in Science, entitled Radically Rethinking Agriculture for the 21st Century. And among the many interesting things you write, you say this: "It is not at all a foregone conclusion that our current crops can be pushed to perform as well as they do now at much higher temperatures and with much less water and other agricultural inputs. It will take new approaches, new methods." You've said today, think outside the box.
Indeed.
All right, let's say we do that the next 5 years. And to each of you subsequently, what are some of the things we need to see happen if we're going to feed those 9 billion people not very long from now?
Well, I think the central issue is exactly the things that we've discussed here. That is, simplifying the regulatory apparatus, investing in adaptation to hotter, drier of our current crops, but then developing new crops. This may entail domesticating crops de novo. It took us 15,000 years to produce, to domesticate our current crops. We need to use modern science to move forward and create and make the desert produce food, not just bloom.
Rob.
Looking at Africa, you don't have to go out to 2050 to be concerned. The indicator that I would follow over the next 5 years is investments that African governments make in agricultural development. 60% of Africans are farmers dependent upon agriculture. Currently in Africa, governments spend only about 5% of their budget on agriculture. They pledge to increase that to 10%, but they haven't done it yet. I would like to see them go up to 10% in the next 5 years. They can't do that, however, if the United States and other donor countries are withdrawing support from agricultural development assistance.
So more assistance, more of a priority.
Government commitment in Africa supported by external assistance.
But I think we need to do that here, too. We still don't invest enough in agriculture. We're not preparing our own farmers, frankly.
Well, you're in the administration. We're going to look to you to help drive that conversation.
Doing my best.
Calestous, 5 years.
5 years. It's really interesting when you look at the African educational system. If you train as a doctor, you go and work in a hospital. If you train as a lawyer, you go and work in a law firm or in some other agency. But if you train in agriculture, you don't go to become a farmer. You go to feed the bureaucracy in some place. And so I would like to see reforms in educational systems where universities can be decentralized so that they can connect directly with the farmers, which is essentially adopting the equivalent of the land grant model here, but starting with high schools, because the bulk of the African population is under the age of 20. In fact, the majority of the population is in school. So it's the schools where we should focus our attention.
And using modern technology.
Precisely.
Yeah.
Precisely.
Communications technology, particularly.
Gale Buchanan.
Well, first, we didn't really talk about the constraints that we dealt with in the paper rather extensively that would prevent us from getting where we want to get to. And just quickly,
go ahead.
Soil erosion, and that's another serious one that still has been with us forever. Water, we mentioned that briefly. But fertilizer materials, there's 78% of the air is nitrogen, but yet most plants, other than legumes, can't use it. And how do we get nitrogen that plants can use? Use primarily natural gas, which is a finite resource. But also with things like animal welfare issues, and another one is endangered species, global climate change, the lack of understanding of biotechnology, which we did talk about at great length. But one of the things we also talked about in the paper was the ideas that would get us to the next green revolution. That's what I'm hoping that some of the folks that's tuning in will share any ideas that we didn't include in the paper.
How do you want those ideas? If they have ideas, how do you want them to share them?
Send them to me, because I'm still interested in this topic, because I think that we've got to get a lot of people interested in what's going to happen on this old planet.
Where do they get them to you? How do you want them to get them to you?
Send them to my email site, galeb@uga.edu.
Sure you want to do this? Huh?
Sure. I really would like to have ideas that would help us get to the next green revolution. galeb@uga.edu.
You got it.
But Dr. Borlaug said we need to be thinking about another green revolution. And I think he's absolutely right. And I think that's what Nita's saying, that we need to really, if we as a group and as the audience and all the people who's tuned in can maybe start an idea that we've got to get someplace. And we've got to focus on how do we ensure that all the people on this planet have plenty to eat. You know, we have 1 billion people now that don't get enough nourishment, they say. There also is another 1 billion that don't get enough proteins, minerals, or vitamins and that sort of thing. So that's a lot of people right now.
I want to highlight something you just said. I mean, you said, got to think out of the box. You just said we need another green revolution.
Absolutely.
Business as usual isn't good enough.
That's not good enough, and that's not going to solve the problem.
But the next green revolution is more complicated than the last one.
Of course.
And that's what you've heard here today, I think.
Exactly. 5 years.
Well, it's difficult to add much to what's been said, but I would say translate the new knowledge into practice across the whole policy front, not just the agricultural or the research budget, and leave the decisions to the appropriate level. You can debate what appropriate means.
Would you like to give us a little definitional?
Well, I had written leave the decisions to local level. Local isn't always appropriate, but if in doubt, I'd leave it out of your regulatory package and delegate it down. We used in Europe to have a word called subsidiarity, which has got out of fashion in recent years, unfortunately, because it's the opposite of what we've actually done.
You've heard a lot from the panel today. A couple of final Twitter thoughts. People are tweeting saying, how do we encourage the government to invest more in biotechnology and in agriculture? Somebody's saying the central issue is to simplify the regulatory process. So there are so many parts of this conversation, from erosion to water to climate change to politics, whether that's on a large level or a small level, the strains of energy, the role of these new areas. Clearly, we can't answer everything here today, but it's been a fascinating conversation with a lot of input from the audience here. Thank you very much, and the audience from literally around the world and our participating agriculture students. Many thanks to you, not only for what you're doing now, but what you're going to do going forward. So to the panel, many, many thanks. And allow me to just welcome Sharon Bomer. She's the Executive Vice President of the Biotechnology Industry Organization and one of our co-sponsors, for a few thoughts. Sharon?
You heard it here in the questions from around the globe, from the remarks of our distinguished panel. We have what we need to feed the world. The technology and the modern farming methods exist. What the world lacks is the political will. The questions we should be asking are not how are we going to feed the world, but how are we going to remove the obstacles to what we know works. 30 years ago, experts had largely written off India and China. It was believed that many of the residents of those great countries would starve to death. But increased crop yield saved lives, raised standards of living, and now have added 2 vibrant new economies to the world. The solutions are in our hands. We need to use them. Thank you for joining us today, and we look forward to continuing the conversation and the action. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And that conversation, I should say, is going to continue. It continues at cropnewsnetwork.com, so please don't be hesitant at all to go to cropnewsnetwork.com and continue the conversation. And you heard it. If you have ideas, Gale Buchanan wants to hear them, because he's got a green revolution he intends to lead and launch, and he's going to connect the 2 green revolutions to help us address this question, excuse me, of how we feed 9 billion people on a smaller, drier, warmer planet. To our panelists, thank you all very, very much for coming in here and for braving the weather and for braving the skies and the oceans to get here from the other side of the pond. To our audience that's joined us via online and our webcast and every other manner, thanks to you. Good luck. I'm Frank Sesno here from the night studio at the Newseum in the middle of Washington, D.C. Hope this has been interesting and useful for you. Have a great day. Thank you.